The member for Warringah has the call.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise to respond to the government's budget papers and the appropriation bills 2026-2027. Now, the budget contains measures that do respond to some immediate pressures, but it does fail the bigger test on a number of fronts, and I want to deal with some of those tonight. Firstly, Australia is not investing seriously in protecting households, communities and the economy from climate risks that are already arriving. The government has rightly spoken about resilience in relation to fuel security, supply chains and global volatility, but the same urgency is completely missing when it comes to climate resilience, the floods, the fires, the storms, coastal erosion and heat waves that are already driving up the household costs, insurance premiums and disaster recovery bills. The government was all but silent on that on budget night. Earlier this year, I wrote to the Treasurer urging the government to put climate adaptation and resilience at the centre of national economic management, because resilience needs to be done in advance. You don't just do it at the last minute. And it's because sustainable economic management and community safety can't be achieved while we continue to spend far more cleaning up after disasters than preventing damage in the first place. The economics on this are clear. Over the last 3 federal budgets, the Commonwealth has allocated about $2.5 billion to climate adaptation, resilience and disaster preparedness, while natural disaster relief has already cost, or is expected to cost, around $9.86 billion over the same period, significantly more, nearly 5 times more on recovery than prevention. I've called for Australia to scale up that investment in climate risk reduction and adaptation to at least 0.25% of GDP, which actually would put it commensurate to the actual cost to the economy that occurs. It's a modest benchmark compared to the scale of the risk, and it would provide a clear, stable and accountable floor for national resilience investment. The government should not treat adaptation as a discretionary grant program. It should be treated as core to national infrastructure, core national security and core cost of living policy. Now, the government conducted the first national climate risk assessment, and the outcome were dire. The findings were incredibly serious, and yet there was no commensurate response in the budget to the seriousness of those risks. In fact, there was just so little allocated to adaptation and resilience. We have to be really clear. Climate resilience is not separate from cost of living. It's not. It is now one of the front lines of, in fact, cost of living crisis. When homes flood, or when bushfire risk rises, when coastal storm damage infrastructure, when insurance premiums rise, mortgages become harder to maintain, councils face higher costs and taxpayers are left footing the bill. And still, there is no proper acknowledgement from the government in respect to this. In Warringah, climate risk is not theoretical. Our community is coastal, urban, bushland adjacent and highly exposed to the natural hazards that are becoming far more frequent and more severe. Northern Beaches Council has identified the long-term climate risks facing our region, including sea level rise, more frequent extreme weather events, bushfires, coastal storms, floods and droughts. Council has also recognised that roads, stormwater systems, seawalls and buildings need to be able to withstand the impacts of the next 50 to 100 years, not just the conditions of the past. And yet local government is not being equipped to deal with those costs. Northern Beaches has already experienced real-life effects of bushfires, storms and flooding, with impacts on property, clean-up costs, repair bills, insurance costs and community well-being. We see it on our beaches too. Coastal erosion is already a live risk for communities across the Northern Beaches, with several beaches classified by the New South Wales Government as coastal erosion hotspots. These risks are not abstract modelling exercises. They're planning, infrastructure, insurance and household budget issues. For so many people, they work their entire life to invest in their home, and then they are unable to insure that home against the highly likely risk of disaster. And the government knows this. Their own risk assessment shows that risk are escalating, compounding and cascading when it comes to people's homes, and so many are unable to insure it. And there is a complete vacuum from others in this place to even acknowledge those risks or have a plan for Australians. I've heard directly from constituents whose insurance premiums have jumped sharply and from residents in flood-affected pockets of Warringah who have been priced out of cover or denied cover altogether. This is the future we risk normalising if we don't invest in resilience. More households are exposed, more businesses disrupted, more public infrastructure damaged, and more Australians left wondering whether they can afford to insure the homes they've worked their whole lives to support and buy. Warringah is not asking for special treatment. So many other communities are concerned about this, and it shouldn't be up to the communities and local people to have to deal with this alone. The government must step up to that resilience piece. We have to find ways to ensure that insurance is affordable and available for the vast majority of our communities and that there is support underpinning it. We need to make sure damaged infrastructure and emergency appeals are there, but we have to build in that resilience. Australia's first national climate risk assessment confirms what communities are already living through: more frequent and severe floods, fires and cyclones, greater exposure to sea level rise, higher cost, reduced productivity and worsening inequality. Insurance is one of the clearest price signals of this risk. APRA has found that between 2010 and 2025, Australian home insurance premiums rose at an average rate of 7.2%, while wages grew by only 3.1%. APRA also found that more frequent and severe weather events are driving premium increases as insurers reprice risk. If people cannot afford to insure their home, then they are exposed to a financial risk. If lenders become concerned about underinsurance, then mortgage risk rises. If businesses cannot afford cover, their investment is delayed. If councils can't afford to protect local infrastructure, then roads, stormwater, beaches, parks and community facilities deteriorate. Yet the Commonwealth's main resilience financing vehicle, the Disaster Ready Fund, remains far too small for the scale of the task. The government describes the fund as its flagship disaster resilience initiative, but it provides up to $1 billion over 5 years, which is $200 million a year. So let's just stop for a moment and think about that perspective. It's nowhere near enough. The budget itself confirms that $200 million under round 3 of the Disaster Ready Fund, while the risk facing communities continues to escalate. So frankly, it's backwards to spend billions after disasters, but only a fraction of that amount preventing that damage and helping communities build their resilience beforehand. Every household understands that basic principle. The other big message that came out of the budget papers and these appropriation bills is a question of intergenerational fairness. The test of tax reform should also be in that respect. So for too long, we know housing crisis has really worsened. Australia's housing tax settings have rewarded those who already own assets, while younger Australians are left trying to save a deposit in a market where prices have run far ahead of wages. When property investors are outbidding young first-home buyers, it is not a level playing field. I support the principles of winding back tax settings in relation to investment properties, that to encourage investment into the current tax settings have encouraged investment into existing housing rather than new supply. Negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts have too often operated together to make established property a tax-preferred investment vehicle rather than a place to live. But good reform has to be well designed. The government has made clear, I think that there is a social licence around these changes when it comes to property investment. But the government has not made the case, and there certainly is no social licence, and there's no clear productivity argument around applying the capital gains tax changes across business investment, shares, employees' equity, start-ups, venture capital and small business succession. That's why I've written to the Treasurer again seeking the modelling, the rationale for the 30% minimum tax rate around the capital gains, the evidence of these, and what is the evidence to underpin extending the changes from property investment to that much broader application. The strong feeling and the strong feedback is incredibly blindsided. The government simply does not have a mandate to extend those changes beyond investment property. And in fact, the strong concern is that it will weaken productivity and investment. Intergenerational equity is not achieved if we make housing fairer for young Australians, but make it harder for them to build businesses, invest in innovation, access employee equity, or grow any kind of buffer or nest egg outside of property. The object should be clear: reduce the tax advantage that have encouraged passive speculation in existing housing while protecting the investment pathways that support entrepreneurship, that support productivity, that support clean energy, small business growth and long-term economic resilience. The Treasurer should release the modelling so Parliament can assess genuinely whether these reforms are finding the right balance, because overwhelmingly the feedback from the community, from that very generation that the government is claiming to be there to support, is strongly against it. They feel absolutely blindsided by these actions from the government. And I can only convey the stories that were put to me. Young professionals who are working really hard they've got good incomes, but between high rents or high mortgage rates, they have barely anything left over every month. They are just going paycheck to paycheck. And what little they are able to save or put aside, they are putting into startups, or they're putting it into shares and ETFs in the hope of building a little bit of a buffer for their economic circumstances. And let's be really clear, these are not high wealth, high net worth. This is not a question of earning an income from investments instead of an income from working and taxing that wage. They are already paying tax through their wages. They are simply trying to save and create a buffer. And now the government's proposal is to come and yet again tear down that aspiration. And I would urge the government to really separate out their approach when it comes to property investment as compared to innovation, productivity, when it comes to small business, when it comes to startups, and in particular where it comes to shares. This budget also really failed and left many people behind. The government talks a lot about not leaving anyone behind, but in a cost of living crisis, there was nothing in this budget for the most vulnerable in our communities. At a time when rent, food, transport and energy costs remain high, the government has not delivered the serious increase to JobSeeker that community organisations, economists and its own advisory bodies have repeatedly called for. Organisations like ACOS has warned that JobSeeker remains just $409 per week, around 42% of the minimum wage, and says the payment must be lifted beyond this pitiful level. It's not just a welfare issue, it's a dignity issue, a poverty issue and a participation issue, because the level is so low people can't even get back into the workforce. It is just simply unsustainable. ACOS and UNSW research found that less than a quarter of people surveyed said they could live on JobSeeker. The government's own Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee has again recommended lifting JobSeeker, youth allowance and related working age payments as a first priority, and yet there was nothing in this budget for all those people. ACOS has also pointed out that the budget settings effectively freeze JobSeeker in real terms over the forward estimates, with no one-off increase and no change to indexation. So that is not adequate cost of living relief. It means asking people with the least to absorb the most pressure. Finally, in relation to the budget's investment in child support reform, this is welcome. It's long overdue and something I've been advocating for many years. The government has committed $182.6 million over 4 years, with $19.6 million ongoing, to make the child support scheme safer and more effective by addressing weaponisation, financial abuse and non-compliance. In the scourge of domestic violence, it is quite shocking that we still have essentially government and institutionalised facilitation of financial control. The child support system does not work because too often mothers are left with a child support debt from their ex-partners, and then the Commonwealth seeking to recover a debt against them from the family support payment. The government knows this is a problem. It's recognised that women make up the majority of recipient parents and that the system has too often been used by perpetrators of family and domestic violence to continue control after separation. Parents should not be forced back into conflict, into unsafe contact or repeated administrative battles with an abusive former partner. So the government must progress to a child support guarantee, and when the parent fails to pay, children don't go without. And when there is a family support debt owing to the Commonwealth should recoup it against the parent with a child support liability. Stop chasing women for those payments, because all it does is give them credit rating issues, they cannot get into housing, and they bear the brunt of it. So there are many simple things that still need to be done in relation to this budget.